and thank you very much for having me. Fantastic to be able to hear two presentations for me too. I think I should have some slides, which, yes, very good, fantastic. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to race through some slides really about a project that we launched just over a week ago now, which is kind of a long time in the making. I've been fascinated by the kind of deterioration of community in this country for some time. And I think, like many people on this call, have long felt like policymakers and civil servants in Westminster especially focus very heavily on economic indicators and economic infrastructure, and not so much on some of the trends in society and communities. So we set up a 2-year program called Repairing Our Social Fabric, which is looking at how to do just that, to kind of to repair and kind of restitch some of the ties that bind us together at a local level. This project was an attempt to map the state of community, both over time, so how has that changed over time, and also geographically, spatially around the country at local authority level. And I must say just from the beginning that it builds very much on the work that that Local Trust have done in the past, and I know that this APPG was set up to champion, looking at left behind neighbourhoods and places where some of that social infrastructure has not been kept up or invested in over the years. So I hope that I think that there are some quite clear synergies between the work of the APPG and what we're trying to achieve, and I look forward to working together in the future. If I could have the first slide, please. So just two statistics to bring out, which are from a previous piece of work that we did last year called The Politics of Belonging, where we did a big national poll, 10,000 sample poll, looking at a variety of issues. We found that 7 in 10 people today feel like community has declined in their lifetime. So the vast majority of people, well over a ratio of 2 to 1, think that community is in decline. And 65% of people, nearly 2/3, wanted, when we asked them, they wanted a government which focused more on giving people security than freedom. And the reason why I think that second question is relevant is that for the last kind of 30 or 40 years, we have had a political system and a kind of a political agenda which has been dominated largely by liberation. We've cared significantly about giving people more autonomy, more freedom, more choice over all aspects of their lives, and that's clearly brought huge benefits. But I think one thing that increasingly policymakers and political scientists are contending with is the fact that some of that freedom has led to greater insecurity. It's left people buffeted by some of the winds of change, globalization, or kind of technological change, or some of the big changes that we've had in society, and perhaps feeling like there isn't enough protection or security or indeed belonging in their lives. And I think these are just two statistics from a very deep research project called The Politics of Belonging, which you can find on our website, which goes into a lot more detail. And I saw there was a comment that just popped up saying security and freedom are quite simplistic concepts. That's true, but we deliberately got under the skin of both concepts in the wider study. So please do look that up. The next slide, please. So this project is building on that, and it looks at, as I say, the social fabric of the UK. We've just defined that quite broadly. There are obviously academic definitions of social capital, which have been around for some time. There's also the emerging concepts of social infrastructure, which I know that the APPG for Left Behind Communities has been talking about, and that this session is looking at. We've deliberately come up with a slightly broader concept because we wanted to effectively capture everything that people felt was important to the maintenance and strength of community in their place. And so we went to 4 different parts of the country. We went to Glasgow, Bridgend, Enniskillen, and Grimsby, and we sat down with local people and we did deliberative workshops talking to them about the things that mattered community in their place. We found that community is overwhelmingly a local concept to people. It's the idea of kind of communities of interest was, or kind of digital communities was quite alien. And we found that people defined community in broader terms than the traditional academic definition of social capital. That's not to say that definition is wrong, but when you talk to ordinary people, they tend to include some aspects of kind of economic value, so things like the number of good, high-quality jobs, the quality of the housing stock, and the number of people who own or socially rent their own home rather than living in perhaps more insecure private rented accommodation. They tend to talk a bit about some of the physical infrastructure in their place, so the kind of physical lived environment of the high street or the town square, or some of the shared public spaces, and they also talk about the importance of civic institutions, including public sector institutions, that go beyond the charities and the associational life that social capital typically focuses quite heavily on. And so we kind of talk about our social fabric indicator being more rooted in place, so more kind of deeper and more specific in terms of locality, and broader in scope than some traditional concepts that we have talked about before. If I could take the next slide, please. And this is essentially a very high level view of what we created. We created a composite index. The intention was to create something a little bit like the indices of multiple deprivation, albeit looking at a different focus. This was about social fabric rather than deprivation. And we brought together 5 what we call threads: physical infrastructure, civic institutions, economic value, positive norms and behaviors, and relationships, which encapsulate all of those things that people said they cared about and were important for their community. We took 79 different statistical indicators that were almost entirely taken from a kind of official data sets, so ONS or government data sets, to ensure robustness and comparability. And we modeled them across every local authority in the United Kingdom. So it was a kind of extensive data mapping and data gathering exercise. And then we normalized those scores so that they were comparable statistically. If I can take the next slide. So just before I get to the geographic breakdown, I just wanted to talk through some of those indicators about how they've changed over time, because I think we quite often talk about this in kind of in quite loose terms. We talk about community and decline, but actually, as one of the previous presentations set out, we don't do that much in terms of measuring how specific things have changed over time and trying to look analytically across a number of different indicators. So we found that on some variables, things have undoubtedly improved, and we need to be very careful, I think, about falling into a trap of thinking that everything is getting worse and kind of a declinist narrative that life is all kind of deteriorating. And obviously at moments like this in the middle of a pandemic, that might be tempting. But so we find that the share of pupils attending a good or outstanding school is rising. The number of community shops has risen tenfold since 1996. Families are eating more and more meals together. So the number of families eating together 6 or 7 times weekly has risen by about 10 percentage points since 1994. And there's been a huge decline in the number of recorded crimes in England and Wales, specifically, since the mid-1990s. And one very clear outcome from all of the work that we've done is that crime has a huge effect on communities, specifically antisocial behaviour, and that the type of that kind of antisocial behaviour at a very local level. But if I could take the next slide, on many aspects of community, we see the hallmarks of decline and of a deterioration in those relationships and ties between one another. So we find that membership of local groups has fallen, and that's particularly fallen amongst local groups. So if you think of residents and tenants associations, local sporting or working men's clubs, kind of local WI groups. All of the membership of those types of groups have fallen, and the membership of the national or professional groups has risen. So pensioner groups and professional groups are sharply on the rise. We have also found that the share of households, households where people are living alone, has risen extraordinarily over the last century or so. Many more people living alone. About 34% of households now sole occupiers. We've seen the decline in pubs, post offices and libraries that was mentioned in a previous presentation. And interestingly, even though the number of charitable donations is rising and the total quantum of charitable giving is rising, people are giving significantly less as a share of their income to charity than they were previously. So in 2007-8, just a decade before the final statistic on this chart, people were giving £1 in every £100 that they earned to charity. That's now 73 pence. So there's been a really quite significant decline in charitable giving over that period. Could I go to the next slide, please? And then when you look at that, if you kind of bring together the entire index and look at it over a geography, i.e. the entirety of the United Kingdom, we find that there's also really wide variation between local authorities. Now, this to some degree reflects the Left Behind Neighbourhoods work that Local Trust and others have done previously. But you can see that the areas where there is particularly strong social fabric are typically the rural commuter belts around London and some parts of prosperous parts of Scotland, and the places where the social fabric is frayed, to use our terminology, are typically found on the east coast of England, so from kind of King's Lynn to Kingston upon Hull, and that kind of corridor up the eastern coast of England. The M62 corridor, which was talked about a lot during the general election, actually, because it runs through the Red Wall, so from Huddersfield to Grimsby. And then you also have parts of Northern Ireland and South Wales where you have particularly fraying social fabric. If I could take the next slide, please. And this just gives you, so these are normalised scores for each of the threads and the overall social fabric, and that's the top 10 and the bottom 10. So that gives you an idea of the type of places, and obviously there is some overlap with other indicators such as the IMD and others. I'm very happy to share these slides after, so I won't spend too long talking about individual places. If we could take the next slide. Importantly, we find a very strong correlation with some of the political volatility we've seen in recent years. So when you match this up against the Leave votes, you see a strong correlation between the places that voted most strongly to leave having some of the lowest social fabric scores. Similarly, the places that voted strongly to remain are typically places where community or social fabric is stronger on the measures that we've measured. Next slide. And this just looks at it from a party point of view. At the last general election, we imputed our scores to constituencies, and we find that the areas that had the lowest social fabric are, lo and behold, the places that the Conservative Party gained at the last election. There is a significant gap between those seats and, for example, the one seat, Putney, that the Labour Party gained at the last election. Liberal Democrat seats tend to have the highest social fabric score, which perhaps is unsurprising, but I think still notable. Next slide, please. And there is a very strong correlation with deprivation. So this graph just shows by decile social fabric scores against IMD deciles, and you can see that not only is there a kind of relatively steep slope indicating a high degree of correlation, that you see lots of the places that we know to be relatively deprived showing up to have relatively weak social fabric as well. And I'm very happy to again to share all of the data that sits behind these graphs if necessary. So the arrows are just pointing out some of the outliers, places that perhaps have a higher social fabric but come lower on the income decile. And next slide, please. And interestingly, we measured our scores against diversity and ethnic minority representation in different parts of the country. Interestingly, there isn't that strong a link at all between ethnic diversity and social fabric by our measure. One of the challenges people put to us was that when they saw our map was that it looked like kind of white middle class England came out particularly well, but areas with high levels of diversity did not. Actually, when you look at the kind of demographics of specific areas, that's not the picture that comes out. And the thing that I take from this is that it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from. Actually, communities of very different backgrounds can have very strong community for different reasons, and I think we need to dive a bit deeper into the data before coming to too many kind of simplistic conclusions about ethnicity or diversity here. Next slide, please. One thing that is particularly important in our data is what we might call economic security. So the levels of stable housing and the types of jobs have quite a large effect on the score of an area, or seem to have a correlation between those two indicators. So you can see that the higher the share of manufacturing jobs, the lower the social fabric score, and the reverse is true for professional, scientific, or technical jobs. And similarly, this is a slightly different measure, but when you ask people of different tenures the extent to which they belong in their neighbourhood, you find quite a significant difference between what you might call secure tenures, home ownership and social rent, which are kind of long-term secure tenures, and what you might call insecure tenure, i.e. private rent. So there's a kind of more than 10 percentage point difference between private rent and home ownership, for example, in terms of the extent to which they agree with the idea that they belong to their neighbourhood, which I think is quite notable when we're talking about some of these issues. Next slide, please. Interestingly, there isn't a direct correlation between, and this is a statistical measure, but we tried to understand whether or not the physical infrastructure scores were related to the overall fabric scores using a statistical technique. And we found that there wasn't a strong correlation between physical infrastructure quality and social fabric. And the reason why I think this might be relevant is because politicians in previous years have typically equated regeneration and place-based policy, I think, with the improvement of the physical infrastructure of those places. So building new train stations, building perhaps new housing development, building new roads and connection links, increasingly digital connectivity too. It seems from our data that is actually not primarily the best way to improve the social fabric of a place, and that some of the other indicators, particularly relationships and civic institutions, are much more important to the overall social fabric score of a place. Next slide, please. Alongside our data work, we also did some polling that looked at how things have changed from the pandemic, repeating some questions that we asked last year, and then at the beginning of the pandemic in March, on the 30th of March, the first poll was. And what we found is actually, I think, really interesting. So since last year, we see a big shift in support for local jobs. And we specifically asked people to make a trade-off, so that we said, would you support encouraging more people to take jobs locally, even if they're paid less? Or would you support encouraging people to move away for work if they can earn a higher salary by doing so? And as you can see, in every region, there's been a significant jump in the number of people supporting local jobs, even if they're paid less. And I think that is to some degree reflective of the pandemic and this resurgence of place and locality that's happened over the last 6 months. And then we also asked people the extent to which they feel connected to their neighbourhood or trusting of their neighbours. And here we see a really big generational split. So older generations, people over the age of 45, are typically much more connected to their neighbourhoods and more trusting of their neighbours than they were just in March earlier this year. Whereas younger generations appear to be less trusting and less connected. And now we can have a discussion about what might be leading to that, but I think that's a potentially really profound shift and potentially compounding some of the wider intergenerational problems that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So that's a very quick run through of the findings from a big 120-page report. So there's lots more to get into if you want to. But just the final thing I'll say is that I think through this work that we've done, the work that the APPG is doing, and I know the work that others are doing, it feels like there was a really interesting confluence of people on left and right from different party backgrounds, different intellectual traditions, looking at community, and that is very, very welcome, and I'm delighted that I can be part of it in some way.